Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Chapter 1. A Cheerful Invitation. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy sitting room in St. Mary Mead, enjoying the dappled sunlight that fell across her floral armchair. She had just finished her afternoon cup of tea when a crisp, white envelope arrived, hand-delivered by young Tommy Pringle from the village post office. Carefully opening it, Miss Marple discovered an invitation, unlike any she had received in quite some time. Written in elegant script, it came from Mrs. Georgina Braithwaite, a distant connection through Miss Marple's dear old friend. Mrs. Braithwaite announced her daughter's imminent engagement and warmly requested Miss Marple's presence at Mayfield House, their family estate, for the festivities. Despite her preference for the familiarity of her own home, Miss Marple felt a pleasant flutter of excitement. She rarely travelled these days, but the promise of a country house gathering and a family celebration piqued her curiosity. Stirring memories of times past, she decided at once that this was too tempting an offer to refuse. Mrs. Braithwaite's letter mentioned the wedding celebrations, along with a note that the family hoped her discerning eye and gentle guidance might lend a calming influence on what promised to be a lively affair. The journey to Mayfield House was straightforward enough, a short train ride followed by a brief trip in a hired car. Miss Marple set out early one summer morning under a cloudless sky. She could not help noticing how the countryside around Highwood was very much like the lanes of St. Mary Mead, rolling hills dotted with sheep, narrow roads lined with hedgerows, and quaint cottages set back from the roadside. Upon arrival, she took in the sight of Mayfield House, a gracious Georgian residence of honey-coloured stone with tall sash windows and climbing roses framing the entrance. There was an immediate sense of history in the sturdy brickwork, and Miss Marple felt sure there would be stories aplenty within its walls. Mrs. Georgina Braithwaite greeted her at the door, warm though noticeably flustered. She was a dignified woman in her 50s, dressed in a smart day suit, her greying hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat. "So delighted you could come, Miss Marple," she said. "We're all in a state of excitement, as you can imagine." Inside the grand foyer, Miss Marple was introduced to the future bride and groom. Harriet Braithwaite was tall and graceful, her brown hair swept into a neat chignon. Her eyes shone with the promise of a happy future, though Miss Marple thought she detected a slight tension beneath her bright smile. Nigel Huxley, the prospective groom, offered a polite bow. He was a scholarly-looking young man, wearing round spectacles and speaking with a mild, earnest tone. One could see the affection between him and Harriet, yet Miss Marple's trained eye also picked up a hint of worry in their quick glances at each other. Soon, other members of the wedding party arrived in the foyer. Colonel Bertram Braithwaite, Harriet's father, emerged from a nearby drawing room. Tall, silver-haired and imposing, his voice carried as he spoke about finalizing details for the upcoming nuptials. Captain Lionel Stokes, an old family friend, appeared moments later, regaling the group with brief tales of his recent travels abroad, while Marianne Clark, Harriet's closest childhood friend, greeted Miss Marple with friendly curiosity. Lastly, Mrs. Imogen Huxley, Nigel's mother, stood apart from the bustle, observing everyone with a dignified air. From the outset, Miss Marple noticed small clues. The way Harriet's gaze flickered with uncertainty when Colonel Braithwaite approached, the gentle tremor in Nigel's voice when discussing wedding plans, and Mrs. Huxley's poised demeanor that seemed a shade too controlled. Though the setting was perfectly lovely, a quiet awareness told Miss Marple that beneath the veneer of celebration, undercurrents of tension flowed through Mayfield House. As she settled in, she resolved to keep her eyes open and her wits about her, for human nature, as she had often discovered, had a tendency to reveal itself in the most unexpected ways. Chapter 2. The Shattered Dawn. Sunlight had just begun to filter through the curtains when Miss Marple awoke, her rest disturbed by muffled voices in the corridor. She blinked away her drowsiness and sat up, aware that something in the atmosphere felt wrong. After quickly dressing in her sensible tweed skirt and cardigan, she stepped into the hallway where she found Harriet Braithwaite standing as white as a sheet, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. Nearby, a housemaid hovered, wringing her hands in distress. "He's in the study," Harriet managed, her voice trembling. "Father. Something's happened to Father." Miss Marple needed no further prompting. With Harriet at her side, she made her way downstairs, each step echoing ominously in the silent house. The door to Colonel Braithwaite's study stood ajar, and Miss Marple entered with measured caution. A dreadful sight awaited them. Colonel Braithwaite lay sprawled upon the floor, as though he had collapsed in the midst of a struggle. Mrs. Georgina Braithwaite soon rushed in, her hand pressed to her chest. Captain Lionel Stokes and Nigel Huxley arrived moments later, wearing expressions that ranged from alarm to disbelief. While Harriet knelt beside her father, Miss Marple carefully surveyed the room. The Colonel's face bore a pained expression, and his eyes were half open. His hand, curled at his side, seemed to clutch an invisible threat. A swiftly summoned doctor would later confirm the suspicion. Colonel Braithwaite was no longer alive. "He was perfectly well last night," Mrs. Braithwaite insisted, her voice trembling with shock. "We had our usual discussion about wedding plans, and he seemed preoccupied, yet not unwell. How could this happen?" Captain Stokes, visibly shaken, stepped forward, recalling that the Colonel had intended to do some paperwork before retiring. Nobody, it seemed, had seen him again after he closed the study door. Nigel, his brow furrowed, added that the Colonel had been uncommonly terse at dinner. Inspector Fuller of the local police arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him a quiet competence that Miss Marple respected. He began by examining the study with a detached thoroughness, asking pointed questions in a low voice. Was there any sign of forced entry? Had the Colonel been ill? Did anyone hear unusual noises in the night? Most shook their heads, though Harriet and Mrs. Braithwaite exchanged fleeting glances. Miss Marple, observing from the sidelines, noted each flicker of unease. As the inspector gently probed the lifeless figure, something on the Colonel's desk caught Miss Marple's eye. A half-finished cup of tea, the liquid cold and untouched since who knew when. Oddly, a faint ring of residue clung to the rim, like a silent clue waiting to be deciphered. She also noticed that a drawer was slightly ajar, papers spilling out in disarray. It looked less like an accident and more like a sign of hurried searching. Meanwhile, Harriet hovered by the door, trembling in her fiancé's arms. Nigel stroked her hair, though his face was etched with worry. Marianne Clark appeared, eyes wide with horror. "This can't be real, not with the wedding so near." Miss Marple offered a calm hand on the girl's shoulder, piecing together possible scenarios. Had Colonel Braithwaite discovered something alarming? Had his fear led him to confide in someone, or to confront them? A sense of foreboding settled across Mayfield House. Chapter 3. Questions in the Drawing Room. The morning after Colonel Braithwaite's death began in a subdued hush, with every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the curtains seeming unnaturally loud. Dr. Mills, the local physician, concluded his examination promptly. Though he refrained from making a formal announcement, his hushed discussion with Inspector Fuller indicated poison was highly likely. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the background, noted the somber exchange and tucked this information away for safekeeping. She was not surprised. The half-finished cup of tea and the Colonel's pained expression hinted at something more sinister than a simple heart attack. "Poison," Harriet whispered, her voice barely audible. She stood near the fireplace, her eyes dark with sorrow and disbelief. Who would do such a thing? Beside her, Nigel Huxley remained pale, one arm protectively around his fiancée's waist. Mrs. Braithwaite, still in her dressing gown, sat rigid on the sofa, clutching a folded handkerchief in her lap, her knuckles white from the tension in her fingers. Inspector Fuller, a man of measured tone and deliberate action, cleared his throat. "The Colonel's demise is quite sudden. Until we complete our inquiries, I must ask everyone to remain on the premises. I trust you will cooperate." His gaze flicked about the drawing room, taking in the cluster of anxious faces: Harriet, Nigel, Captain Stokes, and Marianne Clark. Mrs. Imogen Huxley, Nigel's mother, had arrived moments earlier, wearing a crisp day dress and holding her head high with an air of calm composure. The inspector continued, "There will be formal interviews, of course. For now, I ask that nobody wander beyond the grounds without informing me." Turning to Miss Marple, he offered a slight bow. "I understand you have some experience in these matters, Miss Marple. I would appreciate it if you keep your eyes and ears open. Sometimes an outside perspective can be invaluable." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. She did not relish tragedy, but she knew that tragedies often revealed themselves through the smallest details. If she could help ease the Braithwaite family's ordeal, she would do so gladly. "Naturally, Inspector," she replied in her gentle voice. "I shall do whatever I can." A hush settled upon the drawing room as Captain Stokes spoke up. "Bertram was like a brother to me," he said, shoulders sagging. "We served together abroad. I cannot imagine who would wish him harm, though I confess, in recent years, he seemed troubled. He worried about Harriet's future and had particular views that, well, he never hesitated to share them." "Father was very protective," Harriet added, her voice catching. "Sometimes too protective. He wanted to oversee every detail of my life, but still—" She broke off, tears threatening to spill. Marianne Clark stepped closer to comfort her, and Mrs. Huxley pursed her lips. "Emotions are running high," the older woman said in a quiet yet firm tone. "We mustn't jump to wild conclusions." Nigel cast an uneasy glance at his mother. "I agree, of course, but we must also accept there's a culprit among us, or at least someone close by." At that moment, Inspector Fuller suggested that each person return to their rooms until he was ready to begin private interviews. The group dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the vast corridors. Miss Marple, however, lingered with the inspector. "Would it be permissible for me to look around the study once more?" she asked politely. Fuller nodded. "I've finished my initial examination. Just be careful not to disturb anything. We'll have our forensic man arrive soon." Miss Marple made her way to the study, its door now guarded by a constable with a solemn expression. Inside, the atmosphere felt oppressive, as though the very air bore witness to the final, desperate moments of Colonel Braithwaite's life. A faint scent of stale tea and something acrid hung about. The Colonel's large mahogany desk stood tidy except for a single drawer left slightly open, a stray sheet of paper peeking out. Miss Marple leaned in, noticing an incomplete note in the Colonel's firm handwriting. A phrase caught her eye. "Must ensure Harriet never finds out about—" The sentence ended abruptly as though he had been interrupted mid-thought. Treading lightly, Miss Marple continued her survey, pausing by the window. It was latched from the inside, suggesting no forced entry. Yet a small footprint, perhaps made by someone stepping on a low shelf beneath the window, marred the polished floor. Filing the discovery away, Miss Marple quietly retreated, her mind whirling with questions. One thing was certain, Whatever Colonel Braithwaite had been so anxious about, it had been enough to draw him to his study in the dead of night. And one of the household, someone who knew his habits, his weaknesses, his secrets, had taken advantage of that knowledge. As she stepped back into the corridor, Miss Marple caught sight of a figure disappearing around the corner. Had someone been watching her? She felt a shiver of apprehension. Indeed, if poison was the method, the killer was both calculating and cautious, a dangerous combination. There would be no simple path to the truth. But Miss Marple knew well that in the quiet corners of country houses, whispers of motive and hidden resentments echo more loudly than any locked door. All she needed to do was listen. Chapter 4. Hidden Threads Emerge. Early the next day, the hush around Mayfield House was as thick as the morning mist that blanketed the gardens. Miss Marple awoke to the subdued clatter of breakfast being laid out in the dining room, yet no one seemed keen to linger over their meal. Eyes were downcast, voices muted, as though every member of the household feared revealing too much. Inspector Fuller had made it clear that formal interviews would commence soon, and the tension in the air was palpable. After a delicate nibble of toast and marmalade, Miss Marple sought permission to take a short walk outdoors, convinced that a stroll might allow her to observe things from a fresh angle. The inspector agreed, reminding her not to stray far. She ventured toward a small orchard at the rear of the estate, where she found Marianne Clark, arms folded and shoulders tense, standing among the apple trees. Marianne appeared lost in thought, yet her face lit with relief upon seeing the gentle, unassuming figure of Miss Marple. "I needed some air," Marianne confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I keep running everything over in my mind. Colonel Braithwaite was stern, but murder, it's just dreadful." She hesitated, then added, "I was close to Harriet since we were children. He never quite approved of me. Said I was too fanciful, too easily led astray." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on Marianne's arm. "Grief can be overwhelming when the manner of death is so terrible, my dear," she said softly. "But sometimes sharing a burden helps. If you recall anything unusual, anything at all, do mention it to Inspector Fuller or to me." Marianne nodded, lips pressed tightly together as if deciding whether to say more. Then, with a quick glance at the house, she murmured that she had heard raised voices the evening before the Colonel's death, but could not identify who was speaking. Her face clouded with anxiety, and Miss Marple knew better than to press too hard at that moment. Leaving Marianne by the orchard, Miss Marple followed a winding path that led to the stables. There she came across Captain Lionel Stokes, who was pacing back and forth as though wrestling with some unspoken worry. He paused upon noticing her, then offered a tight smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, you're quite the early bird, I see. I was just stretching my legs." She returned his smile with a mild one of her own. "It's a lovely spot for clearing one's head, though the circumstances are far from pleasant." Captain Stokes raked a hand through his hair. Bertram, Colonel Braithwaite, was a complicated man. Some might say he was a bully, but I believe he cared in his own way. He just had a knack for stirring up trouble, especially with Harriet's engagement. A flicker of guilt crossed his features. I'd hoped to talk sense into him about certain matters, but then this tragedy happened. Miss Marple noted the tremor in his voice. "Perhaps you did speak with him that last evening?" He hesitated. "Yes, but only briefly. He asked about my travels, and we touched on older issues. Nothing of consequence, I assure you." His gaze shifted toward the manor, as though longing to escape further questions. Inside Mayfield House, the drawing room had become Inspector Fuller's makeshift hub. By late morning, he began calling each member of the household in turn for questioning. From her vantage point in a cosy armchair in the corridor, Miss Marple glimpsed Harriet emerging after a tense session. The poor girl looked drained, eyes rimmed red as if she'd been crying. Next was Nigel, who entered the room with shoulders squared but emerged some time later with a taut expression and sweat upon his brow. When Mrs. Imogen Huxley's turn arrived, she glided inside with a controlled grace that suggested composure even under strain. She exited in near silence, pausing only to cast a sharp glance in Harriet's direction. Miss Marple wondered at that look. Was it merely concern for her son's fiancée, or something more critical? As the interviews continued, Miss Marple took advantage of a quiet moment to slip into the morning room, where she found Mrs. Braithwaite. The widow sat by a window overlooking the driveway, her eyes distant. She held a small photograph of Colonel Braithwaite, taken in happier times. "He wasn't an easy man to love," she said softly. "But I did love him. I can't make sense of why anyone would go so far as to kill him." "Your husband seemed troubled of late," Miss Marple gently prompted. "Did he share any particular worries?" Mrs. Braithwaite hesitated, then shook her head. "He had a way of keeping his concerns locked away, especially from me. Our marriage. Well, I chose not to pry too deeply at times." She pressed the photo to her chest, sighing. "He was fretting about Harriet's future, yes, but that's nothing new. He'd often argue about her choices. I never dreamed it would come to this." Just then, the door opened and Inspector Fuller beckoned Mrs. Braithwaite for her turn. Miss Marple discreetly withdrew, stepping into the hallway as a shaft of light fell across the floor, highlighting the swirling dust motes. In that narrow beam, she glimpsed the faint outline of a footprint, a reminder of the partial print she had seen in the study. It was not identical, but it stirred her curiosity about who might have roamed the corridors in the dead of night. A little later, the housemaid approached Miss Marple, shyly explaining she had something to share. The girl bit her lip nervously before saying, I found this note in the waste paper bin in the Colonel's study. It didn't belong to him, I'm sure." The note contained a single line. "I refuse to continue unless you do what's required." Riddles within riddles, Miss Marple thought, carefully folding the slip of paper. Someone had applied pressure to the Colonel, or perhaps he had applied pressure to someone else. The more she delved into the family's secrets and tensions, the clearer it became that resentment had brewed for quite some time, long enough to drive a desperate soul to murder. Chapter 5. Subtle Shifts and Silent Tensions. A restless night hung over Mayfield House, leaving its occupants weary and anxious. By morning, the clouds had rolled in, casting a grey gloom over the estate's once sunny gardens. Miss Marple rose early to a house in low spirits, the parlour fire flickering feebly against a chill that was only partly due to the weather. Yet the elderly sleuth felt an almost electric undercurrent, new details, new suspicions, and the pressing matter of that cryptic note discovered in the wastepaper bin. "I refuse to continue unless you do what's required." Harriet, withdrawn and pale, joined Miss Marple for a subdued breakfast of porridge and toast. She spoke softly of troubled dreams in which her father's voice echoed, seemingly admonishing her even from beyond the grave. Miss Marple offered gentle reassurance, but it was clear Harriet's heart was weighed down by more than grief. There was guilt too lurking in her eyes. When Miss Marple delicately prompted her about the note, Harriet insisted she had never seen it before. "I wish I could help," she whispered, "but I don't know who could have written such a thing." Soon after, the inspector convened a second round of interviews. This time, he chose a smaller, sunlit sitting room at the rear of the house, hoping a change of scenery might encourage people to talk more freely. Miss Marple observed from a discreet corner, while Captain Lionel Stokes sat beneath the glare of the inspector's questions. Pale-faced and fidgeting with his cufflinks, he repeated that he had barely spoken to the colonel on the night of his death, offering only the vaguest hints about a past matter the two had once shared. When pressed about the note, the captain shook his head. "I assure you, Inspector, this is the first I've heard of it. Although—" He trailed off, glancing nervously at Miss Marple, then refused to elaborate. Marianne Clark was next, her distress evident in every tremor of her voice. She admitted she had grown uneasy in the days leading up to the wedding, sensing a deepening rift between Harriet and her father. Colonel Braithwaite refused to relinquish control, she said, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. He was convinced Harriet's marriage would somehow slip beyond his grasp. That night, I heard him arguing with someone in the corridor. I stayed in my room, too afraid to eavesdrop. Yet she could not confirm whose voice accompanied the colonel's raised tone. Meanwhile, Mrs. Imogen Huxley maintained a poised exterior that bordered on imperious calm. She answered the inspector's questions with a cool efficiency, insisting she had been reading in her room until late. "I retired early," she said, arching one eyebrow. "I find these country evenings quite dull. I'm afraid I can be of no further use regarding the colonel's unfortunate demise." Miss Marple noticed, however, that Mrs. Huxley's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, betraying an inner tension at odds with her outward composure. Shortly afterward, Miss Marple slipped away to the corridor where the housemaid who had found the note was dusting a side table. The girl, eyes darting warily about, confided that she had overheard a late-night commotion in one of the bedrooms, furniture scraping, voices raised, and something about paying the price. The maid couldn't identify who was speaking, though she believed it was a woman's voice. Miss Marple's mind flicked through the possible suspects. Mrs. Braithwaite, Mrs. Huxley, Harriet, Marianne, any one of them might have had cause to confront the colonel. Seeking clarity, Miss Marple ventured into the library where she found Mrs. Braithwaite gazing absently at a portrait of her late husband. The widow turned, startled, when Miss Marple gently inquired about the colonel's private letters or diaries. "He kept some papers in a locked drawer," Mrs. Braithwaite answered hesitantly. "I never pressed him to share their contents. He believed a man should keep his own counsel." When Miss Marple asked if the drawer had been tampered with, Mrs. Braithwaite admitted she had heard from the inspector that certain documents were missing, though neither of them knew precisely which. All across Mayfield House, pieces of a larger puzzle drifted in partial glimpses: veiled confrontations, missing papers, midnight voices, and a single threatening note. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, recognized that each clue represented a thread binding this household together in a tangle of suspicion. Nigel avoided her gaze now, as though harboring his own secret. Harriet flitted from room to room in silent anxiety, while Marianne grew ever more agitated and Captain Stokes hovered on the verge of a confession or an evasion. By dusk, the rain had begun to fall, tapping against the manor's windows like impatient fingers. Miss Marple took a moment to gather her thoughts in the quiet drawing room, the flicker of the firelight dancing on the panelled walls. She understood that the closer she drew to the truth, the more the household's facade of civility would crack. In such a case, the murderer could be anyone, but each new reveal drew her inexorably nearer to understanding the hidden tensions that had brought Colonel Braithwaite to his untimely end. Chapter 6. Suspicions and Confidences. By the following morning, a strained hush had settled over Mayfield House, so thick one could almost touch it. A light drizzle pattered against the windows, mirroring the unsettled mood within. Miss Marple, as was her habit, rose early to gather her thoughts in the small breakfast nook just off the kitchen. From this vantage, she could observe the comings and goings of the household without intruding, noting which individuals seemed in haste, which lingered, as though weighed down by hidden cares. Harriet Braithwaite appeared first, hair neatly brushed, but eyes heavy with fatigue. She offered Miss Marple a wan smile. "I wish I could wake from this nightmare," she said softly. "Father's death, the inspector's questions. It's all so overwhelming." Miss Marple reached out, patting Harriet's hand. "Grief often dulls our senses, my dear," she replied. "Sometimes it makes it harder to see the truth, and sometimes it reveals truths we'd rather not face." Harriet swallowed hard, seeming on the verge of confiding something, but then she glanced over her shoulder as footsteps approached. Nigel Huxley entered, looking equally drawn. He hesitated when he saw Miss Marple and Harriet engaged in conversation, but pressed on with a faint show of determination. "The inspector wants me to go through Father Braithwaite's papers again," Nigel said, voice low. "I'm not sure I should. It feels invasive." Harriet merely nodded, her lips tightening. A tension passed between them, as if unspoken words hovered just out of reach. Soon after, Inspector Fuller appeared, politely greeting Miss Marple, before turning his focus to the young couple. "If you would, Mr. Huxley, we could use a fresh pair of eyes on the Colonel's financial ledgers. There might be something we've missed." Nigel agreed, but looked uneasy, and Harriet slipped away, murmuring that she needed air. Left briefly alone, Miss Marple inquired how the inspector's investigation fared. Fuller's face was unreadable as he spoke. "We've found references in Colonel Braithwaite's notebooks to certain debts. It seems he was paying off someone, or possibly threatening them. The notes aren't clear." He lowered his voice further. "Strangely, there's also a mention of Harriet, and a secret that must not come to light." Miss Marple pursed her lips thoughtfully. If Harriet carried a hidden burden, it might well connect to the Colonel's final hours. Later that morning, Miss Marple ventured through the corridors in search of Harriet, only to encounter Mrs. Imogen Huxley gliding purposefully toward the drawing room. The older woman paused, offering a courteous nod. "This is all quite dreadful, Miss Marple," she intoned, her composure firmly in place. "My son is growing more agitated by the day. Perhaps the wedding should be postponed." The comment, delivered in that measured tone, seemed almost pointed. Miss Marple offered her most benign smile. "Such a step would be natural given the circumstances," she agreed gently. "How is Nigel faring?" Mrs. Huxley's mouth tightened. "He's troubled. Harriet is not the only one who lost someone dear." The Colonel's disapproval placed heavy strain on them both. From the way her eyes darted away, Miss Marple suspected Mrs. Huxley was withholding more than she revealed. Nonetheless, pushing too hard might cause the woman to retreat further. With a polite nod, Miss Marple continued on her way, letting Mrs. Huxley glide past with the same poised air she always carried. Outside, the drizzle had ceased, leaving the garden damp and glittering with droplets. Harriet stood by a rosebush, twisting a fallen bloom between her fingers. At the sound of Miss Marple's approach, she looked up with a sigh. "I keep thinking I should have done something differently," Harriet murmured. "I argued with Father before he died. My last words to him were harsh." Miss Marple considered her gently. "Did your disagreement concern the wedding?" Harriet's eyes flickered. "Not directly. He disapproved of some details. He threatened to withhold funds if Nigel and I didn't follow his wishes to the letter. It was humiliating, especially for Nigel. Father had no idea how his harshness could wound." She hesitated, then added, "But Captain Stokes overheard part of it." He tried to intervene. "Calm us both down. Perhaps you should speak with him." Miss Marple nodded. She had indeed been meaning to talk with Captain Stokes more extensively. His unsettled manner in interviews suggested a deeper worry than he had let on. After Harriet departed, Miss Marple followed the gravel path around the side of the house, hoping she might find the captain enjoying a pipe or pacing in thought. Sure enough, she found him near a low stone wall overlooking the orchard. He seemed lost in reverie, smoke curling from the pipe he held. On seeing Miss Marple, he made to straighten, but she motioned for him to be at ease. "It's a pleasant spot," she commented. "Calming?" He nodded. "I needed a moment. This business is, well, nothing can prepare one for it." Miss Marple studied him shrewdly. "Harriet mentioned you tried to moderate an argument the Colonel had. I gather you were close to him?" Stokes blew out a thoughtful plume of smoke. "We served together abroad, yes, but in recent years we had our differences." His gaze strayed across the orchard, as though recalling a troubling memory. "He was meddling in matters that weren't his to control. I told him so." He fell silent, then sighed. "I never expected it to end like this." The captain's expression mixed regret with something else, perhaps a tinge of guilt. Was it solely guilt over not preventing the murder, or something more personal? Miss Marple, having long dealt with hidden hearts, recognized that look. She gently changed the subject, turning to everyday pleasantries so as not to frighten him off. In the back of her mind, though, she filed away each subtle shift. Harriet's anxious admissions, Nigel's reluctance, Mrs. Huxley's guarded poise, and Captain Stokes's repressed unease. Returning inside, Miss Marple found the energy in the main corridor charged with fresh tension. Marianne Clark stood near the foot of the grand staircase, arms crossed and cheeks flushed, as though she had just come from a heated exchange. Catching sight of Miss Marple, she forced a weak smile but said nothing, dashing upstairs without a word. Clearly tempers were fraying, secrets pressing for release. As Miss Marple made her way to her own room, she felt sure the murky undercurrents in this house were fast converging. Each conversation brought new fragments of truth to light, but also raised fresh questions about how Colonel Braithwaite's final hours had truly unfolded. The puzzle, though complex, was nearing its point of revelation. What remained was to sort through the tangled threads of motive and fear, until only one strand could be traced to the hand that had administered the fatal poison. Chapter 7. A missing key and a brewing storm. By the next morning, a tense hush lay over Mayfield House. Shadows flickered in the long corridors as though the very walls were whispering secrets. Miss Marple rose early, pondering the new fragments of information she had gathered. Though she had begun to suspect certain threads weaving through the household, she knew better than to jump to conclusions. One must allow the final pieces to surface in their own time. After a subdued breakfast, Miss Marple followed Inspector Fuller to a small office near the back of the house. It had once been Colonel Braithwaite's private storeroom for records and ledgers. "We found evidence that the Colonel kept certain documents here," the inspector explained in a low voice. "Nigel went through them but claims the lock on one cabinet is broken. Apparently a key is missing. Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. A missing key in a locked household was rarely coincidence. Someone had a reason to hide or remove whatever lay in that cabinet, perhaps further proof of debts or private scandals the Colonel had threatened to reveal. She was about to inquire further when Harriet entered, hesitant. "Inspector, I found this in Father's bedroom drawer." She held out a crumpled sheet of paper bearing the Colonel's bold handwriting. It appeared to be a draft of a letter. "I will not tolerate these demands. If you persist, I'll ensure everyone learns the truth." Harriet's hands shook as she passed it over. "I have no idea who he was writing to," she murmured. "But it sounds like blackmail." Inspector Fuller thanked her, and scanned the page, brow furrowing. As Harriet left, Miss Marple could not help noticing the conflict in her expression, part grief, part unease. The poor girl was clearly afraid of what might lie behind her father's final threats. Shortly afterward, Miss Marple made her way to the library, where she found Marianne Clark in a chair by the window, gazing at the rain-soaked garden. "I feel so helpless," Marianne said softly when Miss Marple approached. "Harriet is suffering, the wedding is in question, and everyone's on edge. The Colonel's shadow looms everywhere." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Dear Marianne, if there's anything you know, anything that might help clear the confusion, now is the time to speak." Marianne hesitated, her expression torn. "The night he died, Colonel Braithwaite mentioned a letter that would expose someone. I overheard him telling Captain Stokes he had it locked away. They argued, but I fled before they noticed me. I wish I'd stayed, but I was frightened." With a comforting smile, Miss Marple excused herself. Captain Stokes's involvement again surfaced, adding to her growing suspicions. She found him soon after in the billiards room, staring absently at the green baize table. On seeing Miss Marple, he exhaled a weary sigh. "This is a dreadful business," he murmured. "I've spoken to Inspector Fuller already. There's nothing more I can say." His eyes flickered with a secret he was unwilling to share. Miss Marple pressed him gently about the letter the Colonel had threatened to reveal, but Captain Stokes only tightened his jaw. "That letter does not concern Harriet," he insisted, turning away. "Let us leave it at that." Leaving him to his guarded silence, Miss Marple next encountered Mrs. Imogen Huxley pacing the corridor, her usual composure strained. "Such chaos," Mrs. Huxley muttered, and Nigel caught in the midst. Colonel Braithwaite could be overbearing, but murder? She seemed about to confide something, then merely shook her head and strode away. All throughout the day, Miss Marple detected subtle shifts, furtive glances, paused conversations, locked doors, and worried faces. It was as if each person feared a single spark might illuminate their darkest secrets. By late afternoon, the rain intensified, lashing against the windows in steady torrents. Inspector Fuller, after hours of combing through half-revealed clues, declared his intention to gather everyone the following morning. "We must take stock of what we've learned," he announced, looking exhausted. Miss Marple murmured her agreement, though she suspected that before the next day dawned, some desperate soul might make a final, dangerous move. Indeed, in her long experience, she knew that when the truth drew close, the one most threatened by it was liable to act rashly. For now, Mayfield House seemed on the brink of unveiling its darkest secret. The only question was who would cast the decisive light, and whether, in that moment, another tragedy might unfold. Chapter 8. The Final Unmasking. Morning arrived draped in a damp fog that clung to the lawns of Mayfield House. By Inspector Fuller's request, the entire household gathered in the drawing room, a tense assembly of pale faces and restless hands. Even the air seemed charged with expectancy. Miss Marple stood quietly by the mantel, knitting needles set aside as she prepared for the task she found both solemn and necessary, revealing the truth behind Colonel Braithwaite's death. Inspector Fuller cleared his throat. "I've called everyone here to discuss recent discoveries. It seems Colonel Braithwaite was embroiled in more than one dispute. Documents suggest debts and hidden dealings. Yet who held the strongest motive to end his life?" He gestured to Miss Marple, who stepped forward gently. Her kind blue eyes swept the room. "It began with those missing papers from the locked cabinet," she said. "Someone removed them to hide evidence of wrongdoing. Mrs. Braithwaite, Harriet, Nigel, Marianne, all had disagreements with the Colonel. But the crucial clue lay in the fragment of a letter Harriet found, in which the Colonel threatened to expose someone's secrets if they refused his demands. She turned her gaze to Captain Lionel Stokes, who stood near the window, pipe in hand. His jaw tightened. "Bertram was my friend," he insisted. "Why would I harm him?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Because your friendship soured once he discovered your unfortunate financial entanglements abroad. He loaned you money for a risky venture, did he not? When that failed, he demanded repayment you could not manage. Worse yet, the Colonel threatened to expose your actions if you didn't comply with his terms. You begged him to reconsider, but he refused." A hush fell over the room. Captain Stokes's face took on a desperate cast. "That's absurd." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, I'm afraid it's quite consistent. You visited him on the night of his death, hoping to reason with him, perhaps even beg for mercy. When he refused and threatened to reveal your failings, you feared disgrace. You seized the moment to slip poison into his tea. Afterward, you rifled through his locked cabinet, searching for documents that would damn you. Inspector Fuller produced a small key. "We found this in your jacket pocket, Captain. It fits the cabinet. Care to explain?" Stokes paled visibly. "He gave it to me, or I found it. You must believe me, it wasn't murder." His words grew frantic. "Yes, he blackmailed me, threatened me. I lost my temper, but I never meant to kill him." Tears sprang to Harriet's eyes. "You were father's friend," she whispered, voice trembling. "He trusted you." A heavy silence settled as Captain Stokes realized the weight of the evidence. At last, he bowed his head. "He drove me to desperation," he muttered thickly. "He would have destroyed me, my reputation, my standing. I saw no other way." Inspector Fuller stepped forward, gently taking the captain's arm. "I'm afraid you'll have to come with me," he said. "It's over." As Stokes was led away, Mrs. Braithwaite sank into a chair, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Harriet moved to comfort her mother, and Nigel hovered close, relief and sorrow etched equally on his face. Even Mrs. Imogen Huxley looked shaken, her composure cracked by the weight of the truth. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "Human nature is rarely simple," she said, her tone laced with quiet regret. "The Colonel was no saint, but he did not deserve such an end. I hope you all find some measure of peace now that the truth has emerged." A hush followed her words, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the garden in pale morning light, a gentle reminder that even the darkest secrets must eventually yield to clarity. In time, the Braithwaite family might heal from this terrible chapter, though they would carry forever the knowledge of how fear and desperation could drive a friend to commit the most unforgivable crime.